I'm here today to tell you where NATO stands and what we must do to stop a war before it starts. And to do that, we need to be crystal clear about the threat. We are Russia's next target.
Hello and welcome to Faux News. I'm your host, Bo Hughes. Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO and other European bigwigs, continue to tell Europe and the rest of the world that Russia is an existential threat to Europe. Why do they continue to make these preposterous claims? It's because they're trying to fearmonger Europe into going down the path of massive deficit defense spending to salvage the wrecked economies of Europe.
When I became NATO Secretary General last year, I warned that what is happening in Ukraine could happen to allied countries too, that we had to shift to a wartime mindset. This year we took the big decisions to make NATO stronger. At the summit in The Hague, allies agreed to invest 5% of GDP annually in defense by 2035. We agreed to increase defense production across the alliance. And we agreed to continue our support to Ukraine.
At the NATO conference attended by President Trump in June, NATO countries agreed to spend 5% of their GDP on defense by 2035. This is a massive increase in defense spending across the board and a level that heretofore would have been unheard of or even thought about in Europe. This was a sign of this push that is being undertaken to mobilize the defense industry to try and inject life into the economies of Europe.
Allied defense spending and production must rise rapidly. Our armed forces must have what they need to keep us safe. And Ukraine must have what it needs to defend itself.
One thing that is interesting about all this, and at the same time very dangerous for Ukraine, is that to continue to use Ukraine as sort of this proxy war theater to provide legitimacy to this defense mobilization, Ukraine is really playing with fire, and I think we're seeing that play out, particularly over the last several months. They are standing on the precipice of possibly losing Odessa, a major black port on the Black Sea. And if they lose that, it's very possible that they will lose all of their territory on the Black Sea, which obviously would not be good. They would no longer have any Black Sea access as a country, which would have serious and grave economic implications going forward. So it's beyond poor on the part of Europe, in my opinion, to continue to string this thing along. And they're doing it for their nefarious purposes, I guess you could say, that being this underlying economic agenda that they have. To draw any other conclusion from this at this point, I don't think is rational thinking. Russia has been in Ukraine for almost 4 years now. They have only succeeded in taking about 25% of the territory in that country. And to continue to wage war there and fight just it does not make any rational sense at this point. None of this is meant to discredit the amazing efforts of Ukraine and their mobilization, their forces, the way they've been able to innovate their defense industry at a rapid pace and become probably the experts on drone warfare in the world. None of this is at all meant to discredit the Ukrainians. It is simply meant to say that they are facing a formidable foe with far greater numbers and manpower at their disposal, and that continuing to fight when already 500,000 people lives have been lost over such minimal territory really does not make rational sense.
Russia has brought war back to Europe. And we must be prepared for the scale of war our grandparents and great-grandparents endured.
To put things into context of just what a large number, 5% of GDP is, one needs to only look at the US, the world's largest spender on defense. The most recent budget that was just approved for the Pentagon for this coming year of $901 billion comes out to roughly 3% of US GDP. To go back to a time when the US was spending in the ballpark of 5% of GDP on defense, you would have to go back to the peak of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars to find that number. Before that, and that was only for a brief period of about 2 to 3 years where it hovered slightly below 5%. Before that, to find the US spending that high of a percentage on defense, you would have to go back to the end of the Cold War in the late 80s.
Бажаю здоров'я. Сьогодні Куп'янський напрямок, наші воїни, які тут досягають результатів для України. Багато росіяни говорили про Куп'янськ. Ми бачимо, я привітав хлопців, дякую кожному підрозділу, всім, хто б'ється тут, всім, хто знищує окупанта. Сьогодні надзвичайно важливо досягати результатів на фронті, щоб Україна могла досягати результатів в дипломатії. Саме так це працює. Всі наші сильні позиції всередині країни, сильні позиції в розмові щодо закінчення війни. Дякую кожному воїну. Пишаюся вами, дякую всім нашим сухопутним військам. Сьогодні виключно ваш день. Дякую, хлопці, слава Україні!
So, what should happen here? What should happen is for Ukraine no longer to be used as a pawn by the rest of Europe to promote this economic program pursuit, let's call it. This war needs to come to an end, and I think that in order to do that, the following needs to happen, and it's pretty simple, really. The Europe needs to stop supporting Ukraine. Zelensky is, in some ways, he's worthy of a lot of respect for having this fighting nature to him, refusing to concede, refusing to surrender. But I think we're probably about 2 years, I would say, past the point at which that was rational and in the best interests of his country. What you don't see in the Western media is that a lot of these regions that have been taken over, there's a large contingent of people in those regions that have no problem being part of Russia. And that's a dirty little secret. That's a fact that is not ever spoken about in the Western media. And therefore, a lot of people in the West don't even think about that in their thought process when debating the war in Ukraine. So that's what needs to happen. The West needs to stop supporting Ukraine so that they have no choice but to surrender to Russia so that a peace can finally be brought to the table and this war can be brought to an end. Going from there, and not addressing the dire economic situation that Europe is in, which is what is behind this continued push for hostilities in Ukraine. Taking that off the table, where do NATO and Europe go from here, and what is the U.S. role in that? I believe that, ironically, some of the things that they're pushing for, Mark Rutte and NATO and some of these other leaders, is correct that Europe, many decades, is past the point at which they should have taken the burden of their own security on. I do believe that they should spend a little bit more on defense so that the U.S. can largely pull out of Europe. I would even be on board for the U.S. completely leaving NATO because of Europe's desire to have a double standard on the relationship. That being that the U.S. can't criticize some of these NATO countries on their politics without Europe kind of being arrogant and coming back and saying, how dare you meddle over here, while at the same time expecting the U.S. to pick up the large check for NATO and always have their back. I think that's a double standard that isn't in the interests of the U.S., and I think the U.S. should leave NATO. That is a very interesting conversation for a subsequent video. I think the U.S. withdrawal from NATO could be greatly used to our advantage by employing some strategic demands, some bargaining power, let's say, for us to either stay in NATO or the conditions under which we would leave. But that's for a subsequent video. We'll get into that at another time. I think that is all for now. Hopefully this conflict will come to an end soon, but given the rhetoric from Mark Rutte and others and the constant photo op operation, PR operation that seems to be never ending over there, unfortunately, I'm not overly optimistic. But that's it for today. Thank you for watching. As always, it's not fake news, it's faux news.